Jonah was a prophet in a turbulent time in Israel's history. The people were divided, the northern kingdom was in constant spiritual and political decline, and across the border, the Assyrian Empire was rising with terrifying power. The Assyrians were known for their unmatched cruelty. They stacked heads as trophies and decorated the walls of their cities with human skins. The fear was real. The hatred, too. And in the middle of this scene of decay, rose the voice of a man chosen by God for an unthinkable mission, to deliver a message of repentance precisely to the capital of this brutal empire, Nineveh. To many, that sounded like betrayal. To Jonah, it was an unbearable inner conflict. Unlike traditional prophets, who were sent to the people of Israel, Jonah received a calling that crossed the boundaries of logic and geopolitics. He was summoned to cross the line between us and them, between the chosen people and the foreign oppressors. A calling that would test not only his obedience, but also his understanding of justice, mercy, and of God himself. It was the 8th century before Christ. Israel was weakened, spiritually anesthetized. The people still claimed to belong to the Lord, but had abandoned the practice of the covenant. The throne was occupied by kings who promoted idolatry, corruption, and dangerous alliances with pagan nations. In this context, the prophet Jonah, son of Amittai, lived in the region of Gath-Hepher, in the north of the country. He knew the word. He knew the Lord. But even so, when the order came, his response was not "Here I am." It was, to run. And here begins one of the most challenging and surprising stories in the Bible. Not just because of the fish, but because it reveals something profound about the human heart and about the heart of God. After all, what would you do if God asked you to forgive your worst enemies? The command was clear, direct, unquestionable. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. These were the words God directed to Jonah. There was no room for doubt. It was a prophetic call, urgent, and loaded with a divine purpose that transcended human logic. But to Jonah, it sounded like an affront. Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The embodiment of terror to any Israelite. The mere mention of its name brought to mind images of war, cruelty, and systematic violence. A people who tortured, raped, beheaded, and took pride in it through public murals. A nation that spread fear wherever it went, that had killed, plundered, destroyed everything Israel held sacred. Why, then, would the God of Israel send one of his prophets to announce repentance to them? Jonah was not an inexperienced prophet. He knew the history of his people, he knew the character of God, and that's exactly what troubled him. Deep down, he knew that if Nineveh listened and repented, God might forgive them. And that was what he could not bear. To him, justice meant judgment. Mercy? Only for Israel. Instead of obeying, Jonah chose to run away. It wasn't just a geographic escape. It was an emotional, theological, and spiritual flight. He wanted to escape the mission, but he also wanted to escape the face of God himself. He went to Joppa, the nearest port. His mind was flooded with arguments to justify his decision. They don't deserve it. They won't change. And even if they do, they shouldn't be forgiven. Every step toward the sea was an attempt to convince himself that he was right. That his disobedience was, in fact, a legitimate protest against a God too good. Upon reaching the port, the murmur of merchants, the smell of salt in the air, and the masts swaying in the wind gave an impression of normality. But what Jonah was doing there was anything but normal. He was looking for a ship bound for Tarshish, the farthest known destination in the opposite direction of Nineveh. If the mission was to the east, he would go to the far west. As if it were possible to flee from God with a map in hand. He found the ship, paid the fare, boarded it. He was a prophet on the run. God's messenger hidden in the hold of a merchant ship. The man who was supposed to announce repentance, now slept, trying to drown out the divine voice with the sound of the sea. But the God who created the heavens and the earth is not a territorial lord. He is not limited by borders. He knows every wave, every wind, every heart. And so, the sea began to rage. The storm was not ordinary. The sailors, experienced as they were, quickly realized this was supernatural. Massive waves rose like liquid walls. The sky darkened with a threatening hue. The wind roared like a furious army. The ship rocked dangerously, threatening to break apart at any moment. While everyone cried out to their gods, Jonah slept. The same man who was fleeing from the presence of the Most High now rested as one who tries to erase reality with exhaustion. The captain finds him, indignant. "Sleeper, arise. Call on your God. Perhaps he will consider us, so that we may not perish." The scene was almost comical, if it weren't tragic, a pagan rebuking a prophet to pray. It was as if the world around him was more aware of the gravity of the moment than the servant of God himself. The crew then decided to cast lots. The culprit had to be found. And the lot fell on Jonah. Surrounded by frightened eyes, he confessed, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." The contrast between his theology and his actions was striking. He said he feared the Lord, but was running from him. The sailors were terrified. The revelation of God's name, the creator of the sea that now threatened to swallow them, sparked even greater fear. "Why have you done this?" they asked. Jonah then took responsibility. "Throw me into the sea. I know that this great storm is because of me." The men hesitated. They tried to row back to land. But they couldn't. The sea only grew more furious. In a gesture of reverence, they prayed to Jonah's God, "Do not charge us with innocent blood." And then, reluctantly, they threw the prophet into the waters. And the sea calmed. What was chaos turned to peace. What was imminent death became reverence. The sailors, amazed, offered sacrifices to the Lord. They found fear and faith in the midst of a storm. As for Jonah, he vanished into the depths. Disobedience had brought him there. But the story was far from over. Jonah thought he was fleeing the calling. But in truth, he was being led, not by his own will, but by the hand of God, to the deepest moment of his transformation. Because sometimes, it's at the bottom of the sea that God begins to raise up a new man. The silence of the depths wrapped Jonah like a cloak of judgment. Thrown into the sea by his own confession, he sank into the waters of the Mediterranean, bearing the weight of guilt and disobedience. The currents pulled him down, seaweed wrapped around his body, and the light of the known world faded with every meter he descended. He had accepted death as the consequence of his rebellion. But the God who had called Jonah had not finished his work, not with him, nor with Nineveh. God prepared a great fish. It wasn't a coincidence, nor biology, nor luck. It was grace in the form of a sea creature, sent by the Creator to preserve the life of a prophet who would rather die than see his enemies forgiven. The same God who had allowed the storm now also provided a living prison. A dark, suffocating, and damp chamber. A womb of second chances. There, in the belly of the great fish, Jonah would remain for 3 days and 3 nights. The darkness was total. The air, thin. The space, tight. The temperature, stifling. The smell, unbearable. Contact with digestive acids corroded his clothes and irritated his skin. But no physical discomfort surpassed the spiritual weight that crushed him. That was the end of pride. The end of self-sufficiency. And the beginning of a prayer born at last from a broken heart. Jonah prayed. He didn't cry out for immediate deliverance. He didn't rebel. He didn't ask for justice. He acknowledged the reality of his fall and the greatness of the God who had reached him in the depths. "I cried out to the Lord because of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice." Jonah, chapter 2, verse 2, the language Jonah uses is poetic but deeply sincere. He describes what he felt, the waters surrounding him to the soul, the seaweed wrapping around his head, the abyss swallowing him. He speaks of gates closed forever, as if death itself had locked him in its prison. And even so, in the midst of despair, he remembered the Lord. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you, into your holy temple. Jonah, chapter 2, verse 7, this is the turning point. Jonah now understands what it means to be completely at the mercy of God. He has no control. No alternative. Nowhere to run. But he has a God who hears prayers, even those uttered from the belly of a fish, deep beneath the sea. Divine sovereignty is revealed not only in judgment, but in preservation. Not only in correction, but in salvation. Jonah begins to declare what he believes. Even before being set free, he speaks as someone who has already received an answer. But I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving, I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. Jonah, chapter 2, verse 9, he is no longer negotiating. He is surrendering. He understands that God's calling is greater than his nationalism, greater than his anger, greater than his ego. And by recognizing this, something changes. Not in the fish's stomach, but inside the prophet's heart. The 3 days and 3 nights of waiting are not random. They are symbolic. Jesus would later use this exact time as a prophetic reference to his own death and resurrection. Just as Jonah was thrown into the sea, buried in the belly of a creature, and then returned to life, the Son of Man would be delivered unto death, remain in the heart of the earth, and rise on the 3rd day. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 40, on the 3rd day, God spoke to the fish. And the fish, obedient, vomited Jonah onto dry land. It was a moment as abrupt as it was miraculous. One instant, darkness, claustrophobia, the stench of death. The next, sun, air, light, and life. Jonah found himself lying on the sand, filthy, exhausted, soaked, his clothes corroded and his skin marked. But alive. Renewed. Humbled. Resurrected, in a way. That beach was not just a geographical location. It was the landmark of a new beginning. There, Jonah knew there was no more running. That his life was no longer his own. That God's mission was not just about the Ninevites, but also about himself. It is at the bottom of the sea that pride dissolves. It is in the belly of pain that prayer rises with sincerity. It is when there is no escape route that we learn to hand the helm to the Creator. The Jonah who emerged from the belly of the fish was no longer the same man who had gone down to Joppa. Something had died in there, and something new had been born. He had discovered that you cannot flee from a God who chases you even into the abyss. And when his mercy reaches us, neither the sea, nor the fish, nor our own mistakes can stop the new beginning. The sand still clung to his skin when Jonah once again heard the voice of the Lord. No beating around the bush. The same order. The same destination. But now, the prophet's heart was different. There was no more running, no more resistance. There was silence, reverence, and obedience. Jonah stood up and began to walk. The journey to Nineveh was long. A crossing of hundreds of kilometers, leaving the Mediterranean coast toward the lands of the Assyrian Empire. The path cut through desert regions, barren plains, and rugged terrain. The heat of the sun, the chill of night, and the solitude of the road served as the backdrop for inevitable reflection. Jonah was no longer the same man who had gone down to the port of Joppa. Something within him had been crushed and rebuilt. Each step was a silent confession. Each day of walking was a reminder that no one flees from God without consequence. He had tasted the silence of the depths. Had been surrounded by the waters. Now, every gust of dry wind, every stone along the way, every quiet night under the starry sky became an altar of intimate repentance. And then he saw it. Nineveh. The city rose in arrogance and grandeur. Its walls were massive, its gates guarded by armed soldiers, and its streets pulsed with the power of an empire that considered itself invincible. Relics of past conquests decorated the city's entrance, images of kings crushing nations, rows of chained slaves, symbols of fear and domination. Nineveh was not just a capital. It was a monument to human vanity. A place that breathed violence, idolatry, and pride. And there was Jonah, one solitary man, with an ordinary appearance, walking through the streets of a foreign metropolis, with a message on his lips and the weight of a divine mission on his shoulders. He began proclaiming the message. He walked through the streets announcing that judgment was coming. That the city was at risk. That time was running out. There was no diplomacy in his voice. No explanations. No declared mercy. It was just a cold, direct warning of imminent destruction. At first, few paid attention. Some laughed. Others ignored him as a madman or fanatic. After all, who would take seriously a foreigner, with worn-out clothes and sunburned skin, speaking of ruin and divine punishment? But little by little, something began to change. Jonah's gaze carried a conviction that disturbed. His voice wasn't one of threat, but of someone who had been through the fire and returned. It was as if that man spoke with the authority of someone who had known death and mercy. As he continued, the stares began to multiply. So did the whispers. The rumor spread, a Hebrew prophet had arrived with an urgent warning. The simple words began to echo through the markets, in the corridors of the palaces, in the darkest alleys. And surprisingly, they found fertile ground. The proud city began to fall silent. Merchants paused their sales. Conversations turned into prayers. Instead of mockery, there were tears. Instead of resistance, repentance. Jonah watched it all with eyes torn between surprise and disbelief. Those he once judged incapable of any spiritual sensitivity were now tearing their clothes, covering themselves in ashes, and crying out for forgiveness. It was as if an invisible wave was sweeping through Nineveh, not of destruction, but of brokenness. And the news reached the palace. The king himself, dressed in purple and surrounded by symbols of power, was touched by the message. He rose from the throne, removed his royal robe, clothed himself in sackcloth, and sat in ashes. It wasn't just a symbolic act. It was a surrender. And it didn't stop there. The king issued a decree: everyone, even the animals, was to fast, humble themselves, and turn from their evil ways. There was a true sense of urgency. A deep recognition that perhaps there was still time. Perhaps judgment could be avoided. Perhaps God's wrath might turn away. Jonah walked among them, watching everything with a mixture of astonishment and discomfort. What every prophet would dream of witnessing, an entire people repenting, was, for him, a source of unease. Divine compassion was closer than ever. But Jonah still carried within him a conflict that not even his time in the belly of the fish had completely resolved. Even so, the city's transformation was undeniable. Soldiers laid down their weapons. Merchants shared part of their profits with the needy. Entire families gathered in public squares to cry out for mercy. A city once marked by cruelty was now bowing in reverent fear. And there, in the heart of the most feared empire of the ancient world, a reluctant prophet witnessed one of the greatest revivals in history, without music, without strategies, without charisma, only with the raw, unfiltered truth. The message had been delivered. But Jonah's true battle was still ahead. The city was silent. Not the usual silence of a calm dawn, but the kind of silence that follows brokenness. The dust of transformation still lingered in the air. Instead of war cries, there were whispered prayers. Instead of blood, there were ashes. The cruel city that once prided itself on its conquests now wept before a God who had been announced by a foreigner. And Jonah was angry. Nothing in the prophet's face expressed joy. There was no relief, no gratitude. While everyone was humbling themselves and seeking mercy, he was consumed by a resentment growing like a weed. It wasn't a passing frustration. It was something deeper. As if, deep down, he had hoped the city would ignore the warning. That they would scoff, reject it, harden their hearts, and then the fire would fall. Judgment would come. And he, Jonah, would be proven right in his indignation. But the people surrendered. And God, as Jonah had feared, forgave. That disturbed him more than any storm. Because the rage he felt wasn't against the Ninevites. It was against God himself. Against the fact that the Lord, once again, chose mercy. Sitting outside the city, Jonah waited. He built a small, makeshift shelter, hoping perhaps to see some twist of fate. Maybe the repentance wouldn't last. Maybe God would change his mind and punish Nineveh after all. But time passed. The sky remained clear. The walls stood. The soldiers didn't march. And the people fasted. Then Jonah did something unusual. He voiced his anger directly to God. Instead of praising or thanking, he complained. He said he knew this would happen. That this was why he ran. Because he knew God's character. He knew the Lord is compassionate, slow to anger, and quick to forgive. And to Jonah, that was too much. He couldn't bear that such a cruel people had found grace. It was as if he were saying, I knew you would be too good to destroy them. And with that, he asked to die. He preferred death to living with the knowledge that God had forgiven those he deemed unworthy. But God's response didn't come as condemnation. It came as a simple, disarming question, is it right for you to be so angry? It was a question that cut deep. That confronted him. That exposed him. But Jonah chose silence. There was no argument. But there was also no surrender. While the prophet withdrew, God was preparing another lesson. During the night, a plant grew beside Jonah's shelter. It grew quickly, with wide leaves and cool shade. The heat was intense, and the shade was a welcome relief. For the first time in a long while, Jonah was glad. Not because an entire city had converted, but because of a plant. A personal comfort. A quiet indulgence. The next day, however, the same hand that had sent the fish in the plant now sent a worm. And the worm destroyed the plant. The sun burned again. A scorching wind blew from the desert. Jonah, once more, wished to die. Physical discomfort exposed the true condition of his heart. What he didn't feel for the thousands of lives saved, he now felt for a dead plant. And again, God spoke. The voice that calmed the sea and sustained the prophet in the belly of the fish now held up a mirror before him. You pity a plant you did not plant, that came up and died in a single day. And you expect me not to have compassion on a city with more than 120,000 people? People who don't know their right hand from their left? Not to mention the animals? That was the last line of the book. The last words of God. And there is no reply from Jonah. The text ends without an explicit conclusion. No reaction from the prophet. No resolution. It's as if the heavens remain silent, waiting for the reader to respond in Jonah's place. That absence of response is the greatest call to reflection. Because the drama of the book of Jonah is not only about a reluctant prophet or a wicked city. It's about us. About what we do when God offers forgiveness to those we consider unforgivable. About how we react when divine mercy escapes our control, when it crosses borders we wished would remain tightly closed. Jonah's heart was still divided. He knew the right theology, but his inner self resisted the practice of unconditional love. It was the dilemma of someone who wanted a God made in his own image, not a God who loves even the worst of enemies. And you? What would you do if God decided to forgive the person who hurt you the most? The sun scorched the Mesopotamian sky, but the most unbearable heat wasn't coming from outside. It was inside Jonah. He had been saved, called, sent, and now, even after seeing an entire city bow before God, he could not rejoice. He was exhausted, bitter, lost in his own theology. He knew who God was, but he couldn't accept that he was this good. And it was in that moment, in the middle of the desert, under the shade of a now-dead plant, that God revealed the core of the entire story: mercy. Not a common, partial, or selective mercy, but a scandalous one. One that reaches the despicable. That saves the unexpected. That shatters the pride of the righteous and reaches the soul of the wicked. A mercy that does not ask permission to forgive. Jonah loved mercy when it was for himself, but he hated to see it applied to others, especially to enemies, especially to those whom, in his eyes, deserved judgment. And that's why the lesson of the plant was so sharp. God placed him face to face with a brutal contradiction. Jonah cared more about the end of a plant than about the salvation of a city. This story ends unresolved. We don't know if Jonah repented, if he changed, if he returned to the heart of God. But perhaps the silence at the end of the text is the most powerful way to teach. Because now the question is no longer for Jonah. It's for us. We're quick to demand justice, but slow to offer forgiveness. We want compassion when we fall, but condemnation when someone else stumbles. And sometimes, like Jonah, we spend more time grieving our small losses than caring for the pain of a lost humanity. The story of Jonah is not about a great fish. It's about a great God. A God who pursues the one who runs. Who saves the seemingly unsalvageable. Who confronts those who think themselves righteous. And who teaches with patience until the heart finally surrenders. This narrative is a mirror. It reflects our escapes, our excuses, our selectiveness. But it also shows us that, even so, God keeps calling. He doesn't give up. He corrects, welcomes, transforms. The mercy that reached Nineveh is still available today. For me. For you. For everyone. And that leaves us with a choice. Will we keep sitting, waiting for the world to receive the punishment we think it deserves, or will we rise, as Jonah finally did, and carry a message that transforms? It's not about merit. It never was. It's about the heart of a God who would rather forgive than punish. Who insists on calling, even when we say no, and who is willing to do anything, even prepare a storm, a fish, and a plant, to teach us the value of grace. If God were to call you today to announce forgiveness to someone who hurt you, would you obey? Are you willing to carry grace where there is pain? Love where there is resentment? Justice seasoned with compassion? Today, that is the challenge. Pray for someone you consider an enemy. Ask God to change your heart before asking Him to change theirs. And say, like Jonah, now restored, I'm ready. Send me.